was 11 in Worcester, Massachusetts, which is a city right in the middle, basically, of Massachusetts. Kind of a strange place.
I
And
had
then,
my college roommate, I want to say for a time, his family lived in Worcester, and it's spelled like
it
Worcester.
is, yes,
Yeah.
yeah. And then I moved to a town called Swampscott, which is a very small town on the North Shore of Massachusetts, right on the ocean. And I think both locations are kind of like have a way in which that they're in the book. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Because the setting of the book is not quite real. It's not like these are fictionalized places,
Very
but
much.
based on maybe the places that you just described, especially the coastal place,
Yes.
Swampscott. So wait, and what's the? Forgive my lack of geographical knowledge. The North Shore of Massachusetts. Is that up near Rhode Island? Like what borders it?
No, so it's
New Hampshire? What is
yeah,
it?
far up north, yeah, New Hampshire. But we were like 15. My mom still lives there, 15 miles north of Boston. Salem is right there.
Oh, okay. Oh,
Gloucester, like those sort of like not the Cape, which is the part of Massachusetts that juts out in the south, but the northern coast. Yeah.
okay, okay. I was thinking when you said north, I thought you meant like way north, like toward the border or something. But it's
Well,
just north of
Massachusetts
Boston.
isn't very big either,
That's
but
right.
yeah.
That's right. So, and I read that you as a child had some awareness of like a girl in your town, and I don't know if this was Worcester or Swampscott,
This was
who,
Worcester.
okay, so in Worcester there was a girl who had fallen into a coma and who was said to be able to like perform miracles or produce miracles like in her presence and
Where is this,
no
bro?
one likes the history of the Maeve character of your book and the way that she falls into this like almost like fairy tale like sleep. You know, she's in a coma, but she can breathe on her own, and she isn't aging, which is magical. But there is, I didn't realize until after I'd finished the book that there is like a real life experience that informed this. Did you know this girl?
No, I didn't know her, and even as it was happening, it was just one of those strange things in childhood where I still didn't even really know what was happening, but like 60 Minutes came to town and it was down the street from where I lived. I had a classmate who lived on her block, and people were kind of just swarming in, and they were like lining up on the lawn, and they would claim that they were cured of their ailments, and it was a kind of a sensation. Yeah.
So was it a Christian thing?
It was a very Catholic home, and the other thing is I was raised in a very Jewish home, so I felt like I had almost no way to fully understand what was going on, except for that, like our uncle called and he was like, "I just saw your city on 60 Minutes, and there's this strange thing happening."
Okay, so what kind of miracles? Like people would show up and they would just get healed?
Mostly it was healing. Well, I think it was there were kind of two things. The like statues and the paintings in the house were said to be crying and like bleeding, and there was like this holy oil that was coming out of like the garage, so there were these sort of miracles of the home just in her presence. And then people who came would be healed. I think there was someone who said she was healed of cancer. There was a lot of chronic pain. Yeah.
What happened to this girl? How did she was in a coma at home?
Yeah, she was brought home. It wasn't a coma. It was like a comatose state, which is kind of what they say. It's like I don't know, an umbrella term, I think maybe. But what ended up happening? She was in her coma for decades. There was an anniversary of the accident that had put her in a coma, where they brought her to like a football stadium, and it was jam packed, and there was there was like a petition to make her a saint. And that, I don't think that went anywhere, but she lived
They
into her.
brought it. Wait, they brought her to a football stadium?
Yeah.
That's the most
Yeah.
American thing I've ever
I
heard.
know. It could have been an auditorium, but either way, it was like a true spectacle.
People doing the wave.
Yeah. um, and then at some point in her, I think, early 20s, she developed a pneumonia, which is pretty common for people who are fed by feeding tube, and she ended up passing away. So it was a strange, mysterious story that I'd never really understood, and ultimately like a really sad one that it just feels like this girl became something to a group of people, but, didn't really have a say over what was sort of what she became. So I tried to write that story, and I just quickly was like, I don't think I want to write this as her story, because it's not the story that I don't even know enough to really tell it straight as it was. And I don't want to be involved in like further exploiting this family and this ultimately child, whose life, this actually is. And so I tried not to write it anymore, and I tried to write something else, and that ultimately became the novel that I wrote. But I think it still kind of worked its way in there.
That seems like a fairly common story for the way that novels come to be. There's usually like an iteration of it that's a failure, but that like informs the one that actually works.
Yeah, it was funny. The first piece of the actual novel that I wrote was meant to be like, well, we're not doing that anymore, so let me just go back and write a short story again. And then the short story I thought I was writing became a chapter and a novel. I kind of like worked my way into a circle and ended up back where I began.
What it was Abe and was it the Abe and Syl storyline is this what you're describing?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think I read this and it surprised me because it's a meaningful storyline in the book, but it's not the central storyline.
Yeah.
So you just came in at this thing from an odd angle, and that's what got you started.
Yeah, I think so. And it's funny because Maeve doesn't even appear in that storyline really at all, and like the Abe and Syl together portion. But Syl works in a newsroom as a producer, and I had all these people who came through, even in the initial draft of that story, that came through her newsroom and were being interviewed, and those other people became the other characters in the novel. So I feel like she was a good point to begin because she led me to everybody else. But yeah, she's not the center of the story, though she is the beginning for me.
Okay, and we'll continue, to unpack the way that this thing is structured, because it is a really elegantly structured novel. But I do want to ask you before we go any further where you land on miracles. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, whenever someone's like, oh yeah, the paintings were bleeding, I'm just like, I'm so skeptical. I'm just, and yet I'm open. I'm like, okay, maybe so, but this shit never happens to me. Like, I've never seen a painting bleed. I've never been healed of my back pain. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, but maybe you've had experiences. Like, what is your take?
I think miracles are a lot about collective hope. And if when you want something bad enough, sometimes it's like the desire for it kind of manifests outside of yourself even. I don't know, you're not the first person to ask me if I believe in miracles, and I don't want to say that I don't, because a miracle could happen to me. But I think a lot of the time, what interests me in them, at least as a writer, is like, it's kind of a story that we're telling ourselves and believing in, to the point that like, maybe we've made it real. We believe in that story so much. Yeah.
Well, I just saw something on 60 Minutes because I'm an old man who still watches 60 Minutes every Sunday. But I just saw something on 60 Minutes where they went to this, what's it called? It's called Lourdes in France. This famous holy site, and I think it's Catholic or Christian somehow. But people show up, and there's like a grotto, I think, where there's, the Virgin Mary. It's known to be like miracle producing, and like millions of people. I had no idea. This is how little I know about the world. But I was like, oh my God, like there are people making pilgrimages to this thing in massive numbers, 365 days a year. And of course, there are these documented healings. There's a nun who I want to say had like she was wearing leg braces and could barely walk, and now she's like elderly and she's fine, and she attributes it to this, Virgin Mary miraculous healing. Okay, all right, like I'm willing to say this is it's unexplainable. How do you explain this? Like, crazy, something happened. I don't know what. Nobody really knows what. But here's where I get angry. You got millions of people showing up. People with like sick children.
Yeah.
They're not getting the miracle. Like, what kind of twisted God is this? Like doling out like 6 of these while like all these other people show up. It just makes me angry at a certain point. I'm like, okay, I'm out.
Yeah.
You can keep your miracle. There's a kid with cancer here. Like, hook him up. So I don't know. That's kind of where I land on it.
Yeah. I think it's like something unexplicable happened is where I land on it too. And it's the next step that some people take of like, and I'm going to explain it in this story that I'm going to sort of tell about it, which will be the miracle that we can all believe in. And then, yeah, line up to receive that same inexplicable thing is also sort of where I
Well,
land.
and we should say too that the church and the holy people in Lourdes do have a financial incentive
Yeah.
to propagate this myth or to keep this thing rolling as a possibility because the millions of people are showing up. I'm sure they're leaving like money in the little donation basket, right? So I don't mean to be cynical about it, but I need to see some bleeding paintings soon if I'm going to be sold on this shit. So anyway, that's interesting. And the other thing I want to say about this girl in Worcester, is the way that like traumatic experiences, whether they happen in our immediate sphere or they happen, at a remove, but still close enough to be felt, those things really do mark us. I feel the same way. There were things that happened to people. Like I remember a boy drowned in my town when I was growing up. He had been out at the creek and had gone under, and it just haunted me. I didn't know this kid, but I remember it in the paper, and it was like, oh my God, like a boy, like my age, he had drowned. And, then there was a murder. A girl had been murdered. She was like riding her bike home, and some psycho had, grabbed her basically and beat her to death. So it's just like, yeah. So, I think everybody has some version of this if you've lived long enough, right? You go through childhood, you're going to be witness to something, whether directly or indirectly. And yet, I would imagine most of us, maybe especially writerly, like sensitive writerly people, really carry these things. And it doesn't surprise me that it worked its way into your fiction.
Yeah, I think being a young child, a young girl, and knowing that there was this other young girl just like down, a few blocks down, and that this story that I couldn't make any sense of because I was too young to fully understand it, and maybe it also doesn't make much sense in a logical way, like definitely was something I carried with me growing up. I didn't think of her for years and years, and then suddenly I was trying to write a book about her. So,
Well, I mean, she's in there somewhere.
yeah.
Do you know, do you have a sense of why with the benefit of hindsight? Do you know what I'm saying? Like maybe it was just like some sort of union between creative impulse and like memory, but is there more to it that you can ascertain?
I don't know. I think probably there is, but I can't put my finger on why. I think probably just the fact that I was such a young girl and what happened to her to put her in a coma was a near drowning accident in her backyard. Like it's just such a sort of like family tragedy, It was the pool in her backyard. And then to have become this national story and, 60 Minutes was coming with their cameras to town and people who didn't live in the city were calling us because they'd heard about it. It just was a strange thing for people to know about the little town where I grew up.
Have you seen the 60 Minutes piece?
I never have. I've read a lot about it. Yeah.
Do you know who the correspondent was who came to town? Was it like Morley Safer?
Yeah, this would have been like 90, 98 or so. Yeah.
Could have been Morley, Mike Wallace in his his golden years. But anyway, it's sad, this book of yours. There is a melancholy running through it. And it's also got this like mystery element running through it. So it's propulsive. It's kind of eerie. Like there's something sort of like it's haunting. And then it's also melancholy. And other aspects of it. I mean, like we should give listeners who haven't had a chance to read like kind of a broad strokes overview. How do you describe this book? This is a tough one to put into like a nutshell, right?
Yeah, it is. I have some practice with it now. So what I usually say is it's about a young girl who falls into a coma or a strange comatose state, and she stops getting physically older. And it's also about all the people, or maybe even more so about all the people who find themselves drawn to her for different reasons. And it's a futuristic fairy tale, and it's a lot about memory, and it's a lot about time. And
it's a lot of, and it's a lot about people wanting to halt the aging process. I guess that has to do with time, you know. But that is a feature of this plot. There is a scientific, quote unquote, breakthrough, and a drug called, what is it called?
Procentus, yeah.
Yeah, Procentus, which you take it and it's like pressing pause on the physical aging. You don't age in reverse like Benjamin Button or something, but you do pause wherever you are.
Yep.
And I mentioned it earlier. I suppose now is as good a time as any to talk about the structure of this novel, because I know from having read up on you a little bit that you started out writing short stories as a fiction writer. And then this book, as you mentioned earlier, was begun as a kind of surrender to the failed novel about the girl in Worcester. And you're like, okay, fuck it. I'm just going to write like a short story, just try to like cleanse my palate or like just do something that I know how to do. Right. But then that short story eventually became this novel. And a lot of the chapters read as kind of standalone. They have that effect anyway. You're entering different worlds, different characters. All of their worlds intersect one way or another. But I think I read a description of the plot structure as that it's like a series of concentric circles. That sort of made some sense to me, but I'm curious to know how you conceived of it.
Yeah, so what you just described is exactly right. I kind of gave up on writing a novel and instead was cleansing my palate and wanted to go back to short stories. And then had this strange experience that I've never had before of wanting to keep living in the short story that I wrote. So my first...
Usually you're like, I just want to get out of here.
Yeah. Well, sometimes my short stories would be like 500 words. Like there was never enough space to really like put down roots and keep going. And this one felt like there was room for that. And so then I thought I was writing linked stories. And so the first pass at this book was really a collection of linked stories that midway through maybe I started calling a novel and stories. I kept kind of giving myself outs of why I wasn't writing a novel. And then once I finished a first draft and really looked at the thing, it felt like, and it got some feedback from other people whose opinions I trusted, that the even though conceived of as standalone pieces, there was sort of this whole that things were moving toward that was maybe meant to be greater than the sum of its parts. So not a novel and stories, not linked stories, but a novel.
Okay, so but like let's try to drill down a little bit. Like taking it from this draft that feels more like a novel and stories or linked stories to making it cohere as a novel, which it most certainly does. Like what needed to be done?
A lot. I think the mystery and hearing you call it propulsive was like making that true was the work for a long time, for years, for several drafts of just knowing how to keep a reader not just interested in this story, but in the broader arc and what clues to give when, what questions to ask, how many answers to give, even like total. Not every question gets an answer in this book, but it needed to be satisfying enough to like piece together towards that central arc and create a structure that was a novel. Yeah.
I think it's an easy novel to lose a reader in. Like an easy plot, because there's so many different plots happening and so many different characters to keep track of, and you're spanning so much time. Like this is an ambitious undertaking. You've given yourself quite a lot of work, and yet I stayed with it. And if I could stay with it, you're in good shape. Yeah, because I'm so easily lost. I was like, oh, I'm still here. I'm still with it. I got it, you know. And so that is a credit to you as a writer, is keeping the reader oriented. And I also felt like the reveals that happen at certain junctures throughout the book were pretty expertly done. Like it was like, oh, you get these epiphanies just when you need them, and they sort of propel you on to the next. And I can imagine that was a process, arriving at those moments and understanding what needed to happen in them.
Yeah, and understanding where those moments of true revelation were. And then there's some that are almost like Easter eggs of like, for the reader who's closely paying attention, you know, There's some smaller moments of pieces fitting together, but making sure that the major ones really did for any kind of reader, that was important to me.
Okay, so I probably missed a bunch of the Easter eggs, but I do think I saw like the Siegler pharmaceutical family. I could not help but notice the similarity to the Sackler pharmaceutical family of our present day existence. You know, they're who are they? The fentanyl people? Or like the opiate people.
Opioid, yeah.
Yeah, so they've, essentially killed millions of people with their products. And so that has to be like a slight dig at the Sacklers, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. And questions that arose for me as I was reading this book. This is a kind of sciencey book, which is not all that common among writers of literary fiction. Occasionally you'll have somebody who has like this kind of crossover knowledge, but I'm curious to know if you have any educational or professional background in science, the natural sciences, or in pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, I don't, but I do have like a layperson's interest in all of those things. So my dad is an infectious disease doctor, and growing up, we would have like Journal of American Medicine. I was thinking about this recently, like on the breakfast table with like some truly disgusting images while just like eating my waffles or whatever. And sometimes my sisters and I would like yell at him to take it out of the kitchen because it was so gross. But I think we were also kind of captivated the way like little kids are by things that are gross are also really interesting. I never had any illusion of myself going into the sciences because I just wanted to be a writer since I was a kid. And even if I tried to get away from it, I kept kind of going back to literature and writing. But in college, I did take a lot. I went to Brown, and the curriculum was super like open, and you could take any class. And so I did end up kind of like dabbling in a lot of different science classes that either I took pass fail because they let me do that, or I shopped during what's called the shopping period just to like get a taste of it, and then left behind. And then in my non-writing professional life, I work in curriculum development at an education technology company. And when I started this book, I was like researching different videos that we were making, and a lot of them, I think I self-selected to be the researcher on a lot of like plate tectonics and like Earth's history and just geology stuff that I was kind of really interested in, and kind of found a way for my research for work to also become research for the novel in that way, which was great.
Yeah.
So
getting paid to work on your book, that's unheard of. It's ingenious. So if you're aware of your writerly ambition from a young age, I'm always curious how writers form. You say your dad's a doctor. Do you have any is your mom a writerly person, or do you have any like artistic genealogy?
My mom's a musician, and she did a lot of like musical theater stuff when I was a kid. And my dad also has, I think he grew up always knowing he would be a doctor, but also has always had like a writerly urge himself. So he was big into plays for a time, I know, in college. So I feel like that
Renaissance man.
Yeah. But my mom was the big like artistic influence, definitely with music more so.
What does she play? Does she play an instrument? And
yeah, piano.
Oh wow. Do you play?
I don't, and I think I tried, and I just don't have any musical talent really at all, but I think writing was my answer to that, because I couldn't do what my mom did, but I did really like books. So
I can't help but notice like there's a lot of griefy energy in this book and a lot of death in this book, and it kind of like not clinical, but unflinching. I'm thinking of the Tess character. She's dying of cancer. The physical manifestations of her late stage cancer or something you're describing in detail. Then there's obviously like a girl drowns in a pool and goes into a coma, and her, she's just kind of lying there being tended to, and you have to deal with like the bed sores issue and the mucus removal. And, there's a lot of like, kind of clinical medical stuff happening in this book. Are you a person who is death obsessed? Like, are you really someone who thinks a lot about death?
While writing this book, I certainly was, and felt like I had to be in some ways because of some of those characters and thematically what the book is invested in. But I also think it's such a philosophical book. Some of that clinical stuff was a way to sort of ground it in some true physical details too, of like death is such an abstract philosophical concept, but also what does it look like and feel like on the body, so that I don't know, the reader doesn't get just like, I didn't want it to be only a book of ideas. So that was one way to make it real.
I like the Tess character.
Me too.
Yeah, she's lovely. She's like somebody who's got some courage and some integrity and some sort of like spirit to her that I found enviable. Sort of like facing down. Like she got dealt a bad hand. She's a young woman. She's in her 20s, right? And she's dying, and she's like, yeah, this is what happens. She's like kind of unflinching in a way.
Yeah, it felt to me like she came to a conclusion that many of the other characters, maybe almost all of the other characters, are like really fighting against. And she just sort of comes to some quick acceptance about it and is able to just make the most of her life with the life that she has. I also envy her.
Yeah. I mean, as a species, considering how long we've been around, we really haven't done that great of a job of reckoning with death. I suppose certain cultures do it better than others, but certainly in American life, it's just sort of something you don't want to think about. It's not something staring at you from the magazine rack at the newsstand, let's put it that way, unless it's like a celebrity, has died or something. But there's no real like deep reckoning with it that I see happening in the culture in any kind of mainstream way. And most people, I think, would just as soon forget about it until it's like upon them.
And that's, I think, why Persintus in the book is the way it is. Like, it doesn't stop you from dying. It just stops you from having to like see the progression of age on your face in the mirror every day. And
just to remind listeners, Persintus is this drug treatment. It's a company called Gene 6, right? Is that right?
Genesics is how I say it.
Genesics. Okay, see? I'm like, Gene 6. What is Gene 6? I was trying to think of what the sixth gene was, if that's even a thing. But Genesics, which is the Siegler's company. Yeah. And they've come up with this pill or this or injection or treatment that you can take that will pause the aging process.
Yeah, and it's just kind of a mask. It's just let's not be forced to see the progression of time anymore. But it is still going on internally, and we are just not confronting or reckoning with it anymore.
Yeah, like I'll tell you what this made me think of, and especially since your father is an infectious disease doctor, is there is a legitimate, because here's where I fall. I'll just like put my cards on the table. Like I'm totally in general pro-vaccine. I have a child with like complicated medical stuff, so like we have to mask. Like I'm pro-mask as a way to protect the most vulnerable. Like I'm kind of on board. We got vaccinated. I'm fine. Everyone's fine. We got our vaccines. I would imagine if your father is an infectious disease doctor, that he advocates for such things as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And the science, I'm kind of one of these people where I'm like, well, if a super expert scientist with no like pattern of nefarious behavior is like looking out at me solemnly and saying like vaccines will save millions of lives, like I'm inclined to believe an expert. And yet the Sacklers exist. These pharmaceutical companies are making billions and billions of dollars and have a serious profit motive and put these opiate drugs out into the world that killed one of my best friends. I lost a friend to accidental opiate overdose. Like this guy was like a brother to me. So like, I understand the collateral damage of these sorts of entities and what they do. And so there is some gray area, for people who are like a little bit hesitant to put their full faith into like Novartis. I sort of get it. Like I get it in a certain sense. And yet, like I think Anthony Fauci is a good dude. Like I don't think he's like the devil, I think he's not error free, as no one is error free. We were in a fluid situation. I've had arguments with this with a friend of mine who's like totally like He's still angry about it, and it's like, listen, it was a fluid situation. Nobody quite knew how the virus behaved. We were trying to, guard against the worst possible outcomes. And that means that sometimes you're going to be doing things that are unnecessary and, with the benefit of hindsight or whatever.
Right.
But do you see what I'm getting at? Like there is, and by the way, I can do this with almost anything, but there is some gray area. Like when you start to tease this out, like where do you land on all this?
Yeah, I always think about the fact that it is so normalized to hear advertisements for like prescription medication, on television and on the radio.
It didn't used to be. I'm old enough to remember when we didn't have those commercials on while watching 60 Minutes.
Yeah.
Like I think the Reagan presidency was when it became legal for pharmaceutical companies to advertise medications on broadcast television. I might have that wrong, but I believe that's when it happened.
And it's not a thing that exists in most other countries either. It just feels like distinctly American. Like the business of health, I think, is where things get really broken, and the kind of overlap or intersection between capitalism and health, I think, is where things really get broken, where it's like, ask your doctor about this thing that you probably don't have and has horrible side effects. Why?
I'm going to sing the Ozempic song to you right now, but I'm actually not. But this is the manifestation. I'm also in Los Angeles, where like you can hear like Ozempic pills just tinkling, just dropping on the ground everywhere. People are constantly taking this stuff, and I feel very leery of it because it's like, okay, we see that it can make people skinnier. Fair enough. We really don't have any clue what the long-term side effects are of this.
Or even truly, in that case, I think how it works. Like there's
Right.
it's very strange. A big thing in the book is, or not a big thing, but a thing in the book is the marketing and the advertising behind the procedure. And I think it's in Japan where they were trying to market depression or antidepressants, but depression wasn't really a thing, and they had to sort of like create this marketing story for like, this is what the experience of depression is, and this is a medication that can cure it. And it's that feels very, very different from there is a dangerous contagious disease out there and we all should get vaccinated against it. It's like a cure for something that you didn't even know was a sickness to begin with.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Chris Rock did a bit about this years ago, where it's like, look, these pharmaceutical companies don't make money if you're well. Mm-hmm. So they do have an incentive to keep you sick because it's just cash flow for them. Like drugs like Prozac that a person has to take theoretically for a lifetime on a daily basis are worth billions of dollars to these companies. So this is the tension in myself. Like, there's the part of me that's like, yes, I am pro-expert, I am pro-science. But then I'm also like, and these giant corporations are fucking evil oftentimes. And, how do we resolve this tension?
Yeah, I don't even know if it's a true tension so much. Like, I think both things can be true, and it's more just about American healthcare and, EpiPens, right? EpiPens save lives, and yet whoever, buys the patent for the EpiPen can just raise the price of it so that you can't even afford the life-saving injection. It's just...
Wait, who did that? Wasn't there that guy in Brooklyn?
Was it Martin Shkreli? Is that?
Yeah, Shkreli or whatever. Just the worst human being, like just the biggest loser ever. And I think he's in jail now, isn't he, or something?
He is, I think. Yeah. It's just a very, broken system where EpiPens aren't just free to those who might need one. Yeah.
Well, it also makes me think about, the moral lines that scientists face. Like you have good doctors, mostly good scientists who are in it for the right reasons. But sometimes these people and their expertise is co-opted for nefarious ends. Mm-hmm. I think I'm remembering something like Kurt Vonnegut wrote about how, scientists have to be careful that they don't get paid to create weapons technology and stuff like that. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like sometimes somebody can be a brilliant scientist and they spend their lives developing things that are incredibly harmful to humanity and possibly even like existentially harmful.
Yeah, I feel like that happens kind of all the time, right? Like Nobel, like, yeah, just all these. It's kind of like a tragic story. People who just want to discover knowledge, and then bad actors come and take over and turn it into something like truly tragic for the world. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's what this book's, that's what this book is considering. And I'm interested in the choice to sort of set the novel in a kind of like alternate Earth. These, like you said, these locations are fictionalized. It's like Mark's Island, which I did Google. I was like, is this a place? I was trying to like put it on the map and I couldn't. And finally I figured it out. I was like, okay, she's just making this up. But what about that choice?
Yeah, I wanted to create, I love a book that's set in a world that's like just a shade different from our own, and it's not even clear if it's a future or just like an alternate timeline, because I just think it gives the writer a lot of room to build. And I love when it feels analogous to the world that we do live in. So the fact that you thought maybe it was real is really delightful
I
to
see
me.
you. She is smiling. She smiled when I said that too. But I'm also like, I don't know where this place, and then there's like an island called, I'm going to screw it up, Palmvira or
Palmavia.
Palmavia. Yeah. So that also, fictional. I didn't Google that one, just so you know. I'd figured it out by then.
Yeah, and I think also part of the story is creating this sort of alternate ancient history. And so once that storyline was developing, it was clear like this is not. I kind of, with all the science in the book, I kind of gave myself the freedom to base it in real things, but then also create something of my own from it that is imagined, because it just gave me a lot of freedom to write the story I wanted and not be constrained by the world we live in and the geography that it has.
So in the novel and in the real world, I should say, this is what it made me realize, or not realize, but made me think of is, in the novel, there's this algae, this kind of rare algae bloom that is happening off of the coast of Mark's Island. And then there are these red rocks. Mm-hmm. And like, I read quickly, so forgive me, but like in terms of the anti-aging or the aging pause that happens, it's an outgrowth of like the drug is derived from the algae.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
But then in the ancient history, there's like the boy who's like covered in the red rocks. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it like, people can read, but I think the point that I'm trying to make is that this book is a reminder that like even the synthetic drugs, well, I don't know, I shouldn't speak to this because I don't know it too well, but so many of the medicines that heal us are derived directly from plants in nature. Mm-hmm. Like it's not crazy to think that there could be some magical drug lurking out there in some algae somewhere.
I don't think that that's crazy. Yeah, at all.
Yeah. But we don't have it. There's no corollary. Like, I mean, were you drawing on some actual like pharmacological history or medical history when you created this?
No, and this is where Swampscott, Massachusetts, the town where I lived after age 11, plays a role, because there is this weird algae that like rolls in off the beach, this kind of like beautiful but polluted beach between Lynn and Swampscott. And it has this horrible smell, and driving home, it's like, you're home because you can smell the sulfury smell of the beach. So that, and sometimes the beach will close because the algae levels and the bacteria that kind of like correlate with algae get too high. So that was the real world corollary for this miracle algae of the book. But there are no medicinal properties I know of from
so you weren't like covering yourself with this as a child in Swampscott. No.
Yeah, no.
And then another thing that just sprang to mind for me that was really kind of like a vivid image in the book is that, Maeve, this comatose child who's like, whose aging has paused and who's just in this kind of like sleeping beauty sleep for years, for decades. There are these moths. There's like a miracle involving moths. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of gross. I was like, oh, the moths are in the carpet. Like, where did that come from?
Yeah, I think I guess two things. One is that it was in the book there are these neighbors who are kind of coming in and trying to involve themselves in this family tragedy that has happened, and just kind of being kind of nosy neighbors, and they won't vacuum under Maeve's bed because they don't want to draw attention to the fact that she would not be woken up by the vacuum.
Okay, because like that makes a human sense to me. You've got this comatose child. She's in this room. The room obviously needs to be clean if she's going to be there for years, and yet there is something kind of macabre and like deeply sad about like vacuuming next to a comatose child. Like,
Yeah.
good for you on imagining that. Like, it's such a specific thing, but it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so that particular miracle, if it is one with the moths, feels like very much born of just like the banality of the situation, and the like just lived experience of dust collecting, and and then moths will be drawn to it. I did happen to have a real experience of moths in an apartment in Brooklyn, which was deeply unpleasant. And
Okay, now here it is. This is what I want. This is what I was thinking must have
Yeah.
happened.
It was pretty awful, and was weird. We were living in Brooklyn at the time, and I feel like the common experience is bed bugs, of people having to go through and seriously clean every item with fabric in it or whatever. But we had this much stranger experience with moths, where we had to have our apartment fumigated and like cover all the furniture. It was horrible. The only good thing about it is that I was able to find a use for it in my book. But yeah.
Alchemy, taking like an awful situation, spinning it into literary gold. That makes sense, because it was like such a specific thing. That I figured it had to be rooted in trauma. And so now you're up in Rhode Island. You said you were in Brooklyn. So let's kind of track your career trajectory a little bit, because I want to say I read that this book took you 8 years to write.
That's true. Yeah.
Okay. That's a solid number.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess it began. I started it. So where to begin?
How about, like, you went to graduate school, right? You went to Brown.
I went to Brown undergrad.
And you weren't writing this book at Brown.
I was not. I was really into short story world at that point. My thesis was all short stories. And then I taught for 2 years. I taught middle school here in Rhode Island, actually. And then I went to grad school in New York. I went to the New School. And that's where, I kept writing a lot of short stories, reading a lot of them. Kind of like my work got much even smaller at the time. That's when I was like really in, like, how small can a story be? How much can you whittle away and still have a narrative?
By the way, the market for really, really short stories, incredibly lucrative.
Yeah.
It's just raining
I know,
cash.
right? That's really why I did it.
Yeah, I know. People, it's really sickening, all these people cashing in on the flash fiction market.
And then I took a job in ed tech. So kind of, in a way, I was thinking of it as a combination of the teaching that I used to do and the creative writing that I love, because it was a curriculum development role and there was a lot of creativity in it. And I started writing this book at basically that same time. So I was done with grad school. I no longer had like deadlines or a thesis advisor, or like, I feel like I kind of like was losing a little bit of my literary identity, and I didn't know how I was going to keep forcing myself to write. And I was excited about my new job, really loved it, have stayed in ed tech all this time, but was a little bit searching for like a project to grasp onto creatively. And that's when I tried to write about the girl from Worcester, Massachusetts, who had been in a coma all those years. And
Did you have a title? Did you have a title for that project?
I didn't, but I did do the kind of like write 1,000 words every day thing for a while, and like log the words and just watch the number grow. And I don't know, I feel like I was under the impression that at some point I would write a novel if I just kept going like that.
At what point do you realize like this thing is not working? Can you take us into that moment?
Yeah, I think I was starting to realize, because it was not it was just an amalgamation of words on a page, and it was not really, it was a lot of like memory and a lot of like sort of childhood experiences of Worcester. And I was getting really lost in rabbit holes reading like these religious scholarly articles about the true life story of the girl and trying to kind of like find where to sink my teeth into the story. And then I went out for drinks with some people from grad school, and one of them, and I was like talking a little bit about this project, and one of them mentioned that she was like, oh, I think there already was a book about that. And that's like, I feel like she said that at the exact time where it was just like,
Just crushed you.
yeah, it's just like, and I'm not doing this anymore. That is that.
Did you have a strong desire to return to the project each day, or was there any dread embedded into the writing?
It did feel obligatory for sure. It was like, now is the time when I sit down and chip away.
And like pile another 1,000 words onto this thing.
Yeah, and definitely by the end of each day, I was like, what will there possibly be left for tomorrow to write? Like, it felt like wringing out a towel a little bit. Like, there's no more drops left anymore.
Okay. So there's that experience.
Yeah.
When you then later get into what eventually became the Museum of Human History, was there a discernible difference in the experience of the creative process?
Definitely. And I think largely because I thought I was writing short stories, or I let myself think that for long enough that I didn't get caught up in there's so many more words to write feeling.
Maybe this is a good trick.
It is. I think it's a really good trick to writing a draft. I think it creates a little bit of a nightmare for revision, but writing, and maybe there were easier ways I could have done it with an eye toward revision, but writing a novel that you think is a collection of short stories is something I recommend, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
But before you get there, and this other project sort of dies on the vine after your friend just shatters your dream, was that difficult? Like, did you get depressed, or you know what I'm saying? Like when you've been working on something, even if you maybe deep down know it's not right, but you eventually have to abandon all of these words and all of these days at the keyboard. Like, did you have like a dark night of the soul, or were you kind of just like on to the next?
It was difficult. I won't say it wasn't difficult. I think it also just felt so right that I was a little also happy to be done with it. Like, I think that
It's like a
friend could have,
relief.
yeah, she could have said almost anything to me, and I would have been like, oh, that's it. I'm not doing this book anymore. Like, I
Just
needed
waiting.
any excuse.
Right.
But it still was hard, especially because it was my first attempt at something longer. I did sink a lot of time into it. I think on the bright side of it, it helped me establish a time of day and a writing practice outside of graduate school that at least that part could, the project would change, but the routine and the practice could
What did
stay
that
the
look
same.
like?
So at the time we were living in Brooklyn. My office was also in Brooklyn. I could walk to work, and the workday didn't start until 10, which was like a great schedule because I could just wake up early, and I didn't have a kid or a dog or any other responsibilities that I do now. But I could wake up early every day and sit at my desk. And I had, we had this small apartment, but it did have room for a desk that faced a wall that felt like very a good place to kind of sit down and focus on a project. So I could get, 2-3 hours a day just sitting at that desk, and then run to work. I could walk, and if I ran, the commute would be very short. So I could get a good morning of writing in most days, and that became the practice for a few years for me.
That's
so
2-3 hours is good.
yeah.
You can get a book done that way. You can get a book done an hour a day. I mean, really, as long as it's a good hour where you're really focused, it's like, I think the average person writes well in a day is like 4, or the most would be 4 hours. There are people who can do 2 4-hour sessions, but I find that there's diminishing returns past a certain point.
I do too. Yeah.
So kudos to you. You figured out a system.
Yeah. So I had to abandon all those words, but at least I had a system from it. So
And that was 8 years. I mean, that was a few years of the 8 years that it took to get to publication.
I think that it was during the first year. Like I quickly began and abandoned this other project. So it was only a matter of months, really, I think, that I was deeply working on it before it burned itself out a little bit.
Good. And then, but the years in Brooklyn where you're working, like running distance from home, how much of this novel did you finish during that time?
I finished I finished the first draft in 2020, and that failed project was 2015. So it was 5 years of working on the draft, all of which I was in Brooklyn. Yeah.
It's so funny. Everybody I'm talking to right now, their novel was written, or at least partially written, during the pandemic.
That's funny. Yeah.
It's just that time. It's just the way that it's working out, publication cycle wise. Like almost everyone's like, yeah, this book was written. And what's interesting is how there is this like melancholy, like I described earlier in this book. This kind of like melancholy energy. There's sadness. There's like a mournful sadness infused into the novel. Do you connect any of that to the experience of the pandemic?
Well, I mean, I finished it before the pandemic. Well, when lockdown began was when I thought, let me use this time to finally finish a draft of my novel. So it was mostly written pre-pandemic, but the fact of being locked in our apartment, as we all thought we would be for a matter of weeks, at that point was motivation for me to just be like, well, I can't go anywhere anyway. Let me finish this draft and start querying agents, which was maybe a weird thing to do when we were all locked in our homes.
What else are you going to do?
But that's what I did. So I don't know that I can really attribute the melancholy to the pandemic. Although
it's predictive melancholy. Maybe predicted the pandemic. You knew it was coming.
Yeah, maybe. It's hard now to say like how much of that was during the revision process, which that all was like, we were really deep into COVID at that point, and I was working on drafts 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, on and on of this book.
What's it like for the daughter of an infectious disease doctor to have experienced the pandemic? You must have been like on the phone with your dad, like, okay, what's the word?
Yeah, I remember. I also am somebody who has a lot, I'm an anxious person. And I remember tracking this weird pneumonia in Wuhan, China, as they were then calling it, in like November of 2019, December of 2019, and talking to my dad about it because I was like, what do you think? What do you think's going to happen? And I remember when the first patient in the U.S., had it, I think it was in Seattle, I want to say.
Yep.
And, that phone call with my dad where he said, well, we don't need to worry when it's just one, but any more than one. And then by the next day, there were like 5. He was like, yeah, now we got to worry now.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I'm with you. I remember distinctly, it was Christmas, Thanksgiving, or it was Christmas. I was texting with one of my best friends, and he and I, we're usually, when it comes to paranoid things like this, we're usually like, and
early adopters.
We were watching those YouTube videos of those doctors in Wuhan. There were like these chaotic waiting room. I don't know if you remember this, but like people just dropping, like doctors like walking out of an operating room in like scrubs and just like falling to the ground. And we were like, what the fuck is going on? And sure enough.
Yeah.
So, did it affect the edit? I mean, it must have somehow. I mean,
yeah, I think it must have. I think it's hard to like parse exactly how, but I mean, there's a lot of loneliness in the book. There's a lot of lonely characters in the book, and I think the experience.
Evangeline, she breaks my heart.
Yeah, she's a lonely kid.
Yeah. Maeve's twin sister, Evangeline. Mm-hmm. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah, I think I didn't know that there could be such a experience of like not like being afraid to hug your own parents, and my husband's grandmother was alive at the time, and like just so lonely because she was living on her own, and we didn't want to see her to protect her. Like that is such a sad way, to live a life, to protect the people you love by staying away from them. I feel like some of that energy definitely bled into the editing of the book.
No doubt. And I can imagine too, like, somebody who's anxious, like has an anxious temperament, which, by the way, most of us do. I guess to greater and lesser extents. But a book like this feels like, knowing that about you feels like you're kind of writing into your fears in some way. Especially, it's like somebody, like I just talked with an author on this show who's like 30 years old and is like death obsessed, like reckoning with death at like age 28, writing this book. But I get it, like I was the same way, and I still am the same way, I think it's maybe healthy behavior to try to lean into these things in an effort to understand them and like engage with them to maybe take some of the fear out of it.
I think so too. And I think writing into my fears was definitely something I was doing here. And it's almost like that feeling of like, when you have a bruise and you can't stop like touching it until finally like it just stops really hurting that much or something. It's almost like that. Like if I just keep pushing on this, eventually it will lose its hold over me. Yeah.
What do you think happens when we die?
What a question.
Well, this is what I'm talking about. Human beings need to reckon with this. Like, what is going on?
I don't think there's a way to know. And I think partly that's why we can't reckon. Like, just being okay with not knowing is very difficult and a difficult thing to accept, and kind of goes counter to human nature. But
it is. It's a fucked up situation.
Yeah, it is.
We are in it is absurd.
Yeah.
That like the clock runs out or something happens and no idea, but like you're just going to turn to dust. I mean, it's just like, wow, that's a lot. I mean, I feel like in defense of humanity, that's a lot to reckon with.
To know enough to know that death exists, but not what happens is, pretty challenging place to be.
Yeah. It's like we lost a bet or something. Like, how did we wind up here?
Yeah.
But I'm always curious, like people it's like we don't know. And yet there are people who are so determined to be certain that they'll, in my view anyway, like invest in these mythologies that are maybe even more absurd than the situation we find ourselves in. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like layering absurdity onto absurdity. But I get it emotionally. I think scientifically, I wish that there were more progress on this front in terms of understanding it. I think this is why I'm drawn to like these Buddhist monks who are like so good at meditation that they can meditate like through the dying process. And they go into death, but then they're somehow revived. They kind of go into death for a few minutes, but then they come back. But they had their wits about them, so they can like report on what they saw. That's as close as I've ever come. I mean, not that I've done like super deep research into I don't think these experiences are all that common, but like that's as close as I think a human being can get to experiencing death and coming back. You would have to really have some deep stability of mind to be able to like bear witness to it without maybe freaking out.
Yeah, I don't even know if I would want to. I don't know. Like, I think I like to aspirationally think I could be the kind of person who is okay with the not knowing, because I do think accepting that life has an end and being okay with not knowing exactly what is next makes like the life worth living, I don't know.
Yeah. What terrifies me is that this theory that like the state of mind that you are in at the moment of death is the key to what happens to you after death. That's a lot of pressure. Like, I don't know if I needed to hear that. Like, you gotta, like, if you're angry or you're super freaked out, it's not good. You're gonna, say it's gonna affect your rebirth or whatever happens in the next stage. Or it's like, oh, geez, you've got to really be poised
at every minute too.
So, that's a fun one to go to sleep with. That's a fun one to ponder at like 3 a.m. But I don't know. And it also, the thing that it bums me out about it is like, what if some really psychotic nut is just in a state of bliss at the moment of death, and he somehow gets a better experience than like some sweet grandmother who's just scared? Like, I don't like that. That's bullshit.
Yeah. I don't think I like this theory either, because not to be too dark, but there's so many truly awful ways to die. And you can't be scared if something truly terrifying is happening? I don't know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So it remains a mystery. And,
Yeah.
your book honors that. And I always, I ask people kind of cruelly if they're working on another book. Like, do you have another
Hmm.
short story going that may, like, metastasize, if I may use that word, into a novel?
I have another book that I'm working on, but this time it's a collection of short stories and truly a collection.
Maybe. You never know.
You never know. I didn't know with this one, but I think I'm definitely enjoying living in each story, and being able to hold a beginning and middle and end in my head for each one, and then letting it go and moving on to the next, which was not something I was ever able really to do with this book because it was just such a braided structure that holding it all in my brain was kind of impossible. So I think as I have wrapped up, the publishing process of this book, it's been nice to sort of complement that with short stories again.
How,
And
how
then
do they
maybe
how do they happen for you?
short
Like the short,
stories.
yeah. Like, what's the is there a common thread?
I think that in the beginning of like the collection I'm working on now, like there was a little bit of the growing one from the next because at this point I have sort of landed on some thematic commonalities across them, and so it's easier for them to happen. Like I know the cohesive elements of the book, and so it's easy to fit in the missing pieces now. Easy. I mean, it's still really hard, but that's usually at this point how it's happening is seeing what I think the whole is and then figuring out where the missing pieces are. But in the beginning, I don't know. I think it's like things that I'm thinking about or curious about, and just usually like questions or yeah, like sometimes situations like this book of stories is very clearly connected to the pandemic in some ways. Like it's a lot about like the absurdity of living our lives as like the world is maybe ending around us. Yeah.
So, do you think that is the world ending? Like how? Like I think there is this question in people: how apocalyptic is it? Like a friend of mine texted
Yeah.
me like 2 days ago, and it was like about something happening in the Atlantic Ocean with the top, the what do you call it? The temperature of the water, the
Yeah.
flow of the water, and
The
he was like,
currents.
there was some disaster movie. I forget what it's even called. Let's just say it was called like The End of the World. And he texts me like an article in Science magazine about how this, Atlantic Ocean catastrophe is happening. And he's like, this is what was happening in that movie, The End of the World. And I was like, okay. Like, how do you grapple with this stuff? And I think people genuinely have some confusion about like, is the world ending? Or are we are we overreacting? And like 5,000 years from now, are people, going to be laughing at us for freaking out so badly? Like,
Yeah. A question I have had lately is like, does every generation think that it could be the last one? Like, is there kind of this feeling of impending doom always, and it's impossible to even compare across time periods because we only live now. Like imagine living through a world war, right? Like maybe you didn't see it on your news feed because you didn't have social media, and so maybe that's why it feels especially urgent right now, and everyone is sending images of wildfires popping up literally across the planet. But I don't know. I mean, there's been global calamity for as long as there's been a world, right? Like I don't know. But I say that as somebody who does really feel like maybe the world is ending, and that's like how I try to cope with it.
the sciencey side of you is like, wait a
Yeah.
minute, how do they like? I get this theory that like the domino effect of like species
Yeah.
collapsing, like entire populations of fish and algae just dying off, the bleaching of
Yeah.
the coral reefs. Like eventually, that's going to come back to bite everyone and everything, right? I mean, these things are in delicate balance,
Yeah.
and it's very relational. So it would be in our best interest as a species to get a handle on this, but I don't know if we have it in us.
Yeah.
That's sort of fucking crazy when you think about it. Like we just can't. And this is, this is tied to the way that I felt about the pandemic, which I should say, under any president other than Donald Trump in our history, Republican or Democrat, I think would have been handled entirely differently,
Yeah.
and the results would have been entirely different. I do believe that. He was a uniquely bad. He was a uniquely bad figure to be presiding over a public health emergency in an election year of all times. You know, it just added to the disaster in ways that are hard to quantify, but are large. But that aside, you know, climate change, the pandemic, these things that affect all of us, that we all have a vested interest in fixing. It is maybe the most depressing part of it was the way in which we could not come together and still can't come together around like just a positive, proactive approach to helping make sure that we're all living in a habitable planet or that we're all protected from a potentially deadly disease.
Yeah. I
Like,
just
this-
had COVID for the first time last week, 2 weeks ago. And I had
How
held
was
up.
it?
It was really rough.
Felt
it
like
was-
shit, right?
I felt awful.
Yeah.
And the part that was so shocking to me after having made it 3 years without catching COVID and then finally getting it was just there was like no, I was like, where are the guidelines? What am I supposed to be doing? And
Did you
know,
take
it's-
Paxlovid?
I didn't. But even just like knowing when I was okay to be unmasked in public, or, you know, it's like people say 5 days because they want you to go back to work, maybe, and not because you're actually not contagious anymore. And I don't know. It was
Yeah.
shocking.
Yeah. You know,
But
there's so much resistance to, at this point, people I guess people are kind of all over the map with it. There's so many people who are like, it's fine. And then there's like an article in the Washington Post just the other day about like,
yeah, I saw
actually
this
long
one.
long COVID is a real thing, and getting COVID, even if you recover from it,
Yeah.
is like still not good for your long-term health and can lead to like serious issues down the road. It's not good to get COVID.
Yeah.
And then I have a child who's like in a higher risk category. And one of the things that angers me so much about humanity is how like healthy people who are not in these high risk categories are so indignant. I'm not wearing a fucking mask. And it's like, hey, dipshit, it's not for you.
Yeah.
It's not for you. It's to protect kids like my son or like elderly people, you know? Like, why can people not wrap their heads around that? It's not about you.
Yeah. I don't know. It's really frustrating though. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. And it'll be interesting too as we get into the fall, just to kind of wrap things up on a cheery note. But if this, you know, there's a new variant as there will be and, you know, continues to be, I think as the colder weather starts to close in the Northern Hemisphere, you know, we get to the winter, these things, I think we're already starting to see it spread. A friend of mine just went down with it. You went down with it. It's going around right now, and it's going to there's going to be a wave. And will there be public health officials saying, hey, it's a good idea to mask up? I don't think people will do it. And like most people anyway.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like it'll be mostly, it just feels like we're all on our own somehow in this, which is really crazy after all this time. But
Yeah.
yeah.
All right. Well, we're going to pipe your dad in now. I have him
Yeah.
waiting.
Perfect.
Surprise. Yeah. I didn't want to tell you till the end, but we brought him in to bring us down off the ledge. But it has been a delight to meet you. I'm glad we got to spotlight the Museum of Human History in the book club this month. This is an impressive debut. It's your debut, right?
It is. Yeah.
Yeah. 8 years of work, and you didn't make it easy on yourself. This is a punishing amount of thought work. You know, I know it from having tried to write books before. The amount of intersecting storylines, the amount of imaginative work that you have to do to sort of create this parallel world, and then the biological circumstances and the pharmacological circumstances that kind of enable the plot to make all that stuff happen on the page without losing the reader, like bringing the reader in and making the world of the story believable. That's hard to do, and you did it well. So
Thank you.
kudos to you. Best of luck on the story collection, which may or may not become a 1,000-page novel. Who knows?
Yeah.
I wish you luck.
Thank you so much.